Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 236. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about Motor City, Motown, and Mackinac Island as we go to Michigan.
Cathedral, I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have three news stories for you. The first one is a good news story. Apparently, with the tough regulations that the Department of Transportation has put in place of fines of up to $27,500 per passenger for each flight that is delayed on the ground for more than 3 hours, we're having fewer flights delayed on the ground. So, you get what you measure. And then you know how irritating it is when you go on an airplane and they mix up your luggage and you end up with somebody else's luggage. Think of the parents that had the same thing happen, except with two unaccompanied minors. One was flying through Minneapolis-St. Paul heading to Boston and the other to Cleveland, and they got swapped accidentally. Unfortunately for the possibility of a Disney movie being made out of this, they were not in fact two identical twins separated at birth. And then here's an interesting story that came from the AP. They say it's one of the safest places in America, and it's getting safer. If you guessed the U.S.-Mexico border, then I'm surprised because, of course, all of the news that's coming out about the border, but they looked at the top 4 big cities in America with the lowest rates of crime, and they're all in border states. San Diego, Phoenix, El Paso, and Austin all have the lowest rates of violent crime. And your average Border Patrol agent is more than 3 times less likely to get assaulted than your average police officer. For links to all of those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. Amateur Traveler is again being sponsored by Audible this week. To get a free 2-week trial for Audible, including your free audiobook, go to amateurtraveler.com/freebook. I'd like to welcome back to the show Erik Smith. Erik has come on the show before talking to us about national parks. In fact, we referred to that show just last week. But Erik has come back to talk about his home state of Michigan. Erik, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Chris. It's good to be back.
Now, I have been on vacation in Michigan. but I'm probably not the best person to describe it. I believe I was 2. And it was one of my very first memories was getting lost on the Mackinac Island ferry. So I'm probably not the best person to describe Michigan. Why should I go back to Michigan?
Well, I think Michigan surprises a lot of people. What you read about and what you hear about in the news is Detroit and all the economic struggles that the city has had. But there's so much more to Michigan than just Detroit. If you look at Michigan and know people from Michigan, and they always see us do the really annoying thing where we hold up our hand and point where we're from.
I was wondering at the point I said, when you look at Michigan, were you in fact holding up your hand?
Yeah, I try not to do that anymore because I'm surprised at how much it annoys people. But I will, since nobody can see this right now, I'll hold up my hand and point to the lower part of where my palm is, because that's the Detroit area. I live in the Detroit area now and grew up here, but I've had a chance to live in other parts of Michigan. The Detroit area is one real small part of Michigan, as would be the case with a lot of states with their main city, doesn't really define the rest of the states. I will say this, the reputation that Detroit has of being crime-ridden and being just a place of total despair is partially warranted, but Detroit also has a lot of things that are going for it as well. You hear a lot about the crime rate and then the auto companies bailing on us and our economy being in shambles. But Detroit still carries on. People still live here and work here. And we do it in a very workmanlike, very American fashion.
And we did actually mention Detroit on the podcast 2 weeks ago on Ghana because Lonely Planet considers Detroit their least favorite city in the world. So, yeah, you've gotten some bad ink for sure. If we're flying in, we would normally fly into Detroit, though? Or
yeah.
Okay.
Detroit Metro Airport is the big airport in the state. I was going to mention that reference in the Ghana podcast. I've heard that so many times. I meet people around the world. I just got back from a trip in Israel, which was, of course, inspired by the Amateur Traveler. But I got back, and then when I would tell people there that I was from Detroit, people would instantly step back a step or two and think, oh, no, that's horrible. And my friends all asked me, are you nervous going to Israel? And I said, well, I'm from Detroit. How could I be nervous in Israel? But Detroit is, like I say, only one small part of the state. But most people, when they fly into Michigan, would fly into Detroit.
And I actually had a coworker who just moved back to the Detroit area to Grosse Pointe, made famous in Grosse Pointe Blank, in the movie of the same name.
Yes.
So if we had a week or 2 weeks to explore Michigan, what kind of itinerary would you lay out for us?
Obviously, if you're coming into the state flying in, you're going to rent your car and start in Detroit. And again, most people would think, well, I'm going to get out of Detroit as quickly as possible. But I would mention just a couple things about Detroit that really set it aside. The city itself is what you see. It's a lot of burnt out buildings and a lot of kind of scary neighborhoods. The real core of the downtown on the river is the area around the Renaissance Center, which is those buildings that you see in any picture you see of Detroit. In the enhanced version, you'll probably be able to flash up a picture that I've got of the Renaissance building there. And it's not Chicago, and it's not a lot of the places where you can stroll downtown, but there's still a nice small area down there. There's an area called Greektown, which has been renovated and has some casinos and stuff around it. The real action in Detroit is in the suburbs area, especially in a suburb called Dearborn, where the Henry Ford Museum and Greenfield Village are located. The Henry Ford Museum is a museum, as you would figure, that focuses a lot on the automobile history, especially the history as it relates to Detroit and the way it shaped American life. But it also has some other things as far as right now there's an exhibit on the struggle for civil rights. So it's a pretty diverse museum. The Greenfield Village is your classic open air museum. And I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the type of open air museums that they do in Europe. And Greenfield Village is much like that. It has homes that have been moved from all over the country. The most famous one is Thomas Edison's Menlo Park, New Jersey lab was moved here. It's not, he was famous for being from New Jersey, but Henry Ford actually had the building moved here, and you can walk around in his old Menlo Park lab. And Greenfield Village is also a place where you go if you want to ride a Model T. And they have some old famous restored railroads, and they have a reproduction of a farm from the 1880s. So again, that's one of the places I think when people come to the Detroit area, it'd be a shame if they missed. But again, besides the Motown history, which we have here, there's a small Motown museum, which is pretty good. And we have some pretty good museums.
And when you say Motown, not all of our listeners are either music buffs necessarily or from the U.S. So could you give a little explanation of what you mean by Motown?
Well, by Motown, I mean the sound that originated in Detroit in the 50s, which would include Diana Ross and the Supremes and the Four Tops and Stevie Wonder. He's not from this area necessarily, but his music was made famous in this area. So it's a lot of Marvin Gaye, that kind of music has also always been from this area. And what you see when you go to the Motown Museum is the creator of Motown Records, which really began to popularize this music before, of course, he moved to California, as everybody does. He lived here for a long time and made the labels famous here. And like I say, Diana Ross and the Supremes are probably the most famous of those groups. But Motown has had an influence on a lot of people, including Michael Jackson, who always listed Motown as one of the things that always inspired him.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, I was wondering if there was something to see for the Motown history.
There is a museum. It's in let's put it this way, it's in a transitional neighborhood. So you're not going to take public transportation there. In fact, that's one of the complaints people have about Detroit is the public transport is very poor. We have what's called the People Mover, which is like a Disney-style monorail, which connects 14 sites downtown and runs in a circle, but doesn't get you in and out of the suburbs, which is where most people stay. So that's one of the difficulties. It does connect all the major museums, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, and the Renaissance Center. But again, it doesn't connect you with anywhere outside the city. So I will say this, if you don't have your own transport, Detroit's probably not the place for you.
Well, and if you're not a big believer in cars, then Detroit may not be the city to go to anyway.
Exactly, yeah. So much of our history is built on the automotive industry, and that's what's, again, hit Detroit pretty hard now. Again, people hear the image and have seen the news of what's gone on. It is a rough time in here, but people are carrying on. This city's not going to shrivel up and go away. A lot of people have seen the Michael Moore film Roger and Me and saw what happened to Flint, Michigan, which is not a city I intended to talk about at all in this podcast, but it's not like that in Detroit. We're not completely abandoned. The city's going to go on. It's just we need to find some way to expand our economies. So, but most people get out of Detroit. And like I say, the real gems in Michigan, and the reason I pitched the show to you on a podcast is because where Michigan starts is really outside Detroit. The lower part of Michigan, pretty much south of Lansing, which is the capital, which is right in the center of the state. So if you hold up your hand and you point right in the center, that's where Lansing's going to be. The lower half is mostly of our main cities, and the cities are nice. Ann Arbor especially is a European feeling style city. It's with its downtown area that has shops and restaurants and people walking from residential neighborhoods. It's one of those cities that you drive into, which you see more commonly on the East Coast, where you say, well, this is how people live in Europe, where they just stroll out to have their meal and then they walk and go to the theater, or they walk down the street and look at the shops. Ann Arbor is also home to the University of Michigan. It also has some nice museums. It has a very good hands-on children's museum. But what I really wanted to talk about was getting north of Lansing, especially the west coast of Michigan, and also the Upper Peninsula. Those are the two areas of immense natural beauty. The west coast is on Lake Michigan, right across the lake from Chicago and from Wisconsin, and it has beautiful sand dunes. The cities along the west coast are Muskegon, and there's also Ludington, which is another smaller town. But it's once you get north of Ludington in the area around Traverse City, Michigan, that is the area that I always tell people. I've been all over the world, but if I have to vacation somewhere, I love going to the Traverse City area. Traverse City is a city of about 140,000. It's certainly not a huge metropolis. I remember going there in the 80s when I first started vacationing up there, and Traverse City was this sleepy town of 15,000. Well, obviously, if it's that had that kind of population growth, people are onto something. And that's exactly what the case is with Traverse City. There's so much diversity just in the hour-and-a-half area around there. You can go canoeing and boating out on the lakes. Traverse City itself, the city is also kind of like Ann Arbor. It's very European feeling. It's got a lot of nice restaurants downtown, and there are shops, and people just enjoy strolling Front Street, which is downtown Traverse City. But Traverse City itself is situated on a bay, and there are two halves of the bay, which is divided by another peninsula. And on the peninsula, there are some great wineries. Traverse City is famous for its wineries. I know people, of course, think of Napa out by where you're from, and they think, well, that's the key to American winemaking. But the area around Traverse City also turns out some award-winning wines. And they have anything from the really small little wineries, like my friends own a winery called Leftwood Charlie, which is just this small winery that they started 10 years ago. And they produce a lot less vintages than would be the major ones. There are some major ones called Chateau Grand Traverse, which a lot of people have heard of, and they're the huge wineries which produce and send all over the United States. But there's all those kind of wineries. You can start with the really small, and you can go up to the really large, and you can spend days just touring wineries. In fact, I know some of my wine-loving friends who have done that, just gone up there, and I asked them, did you go canoeing? No. Did you go to Sleeping Bear Dunes? No. Well, what'd you do? Well, we spent 5 days touring wineries. Well, that's completely possible to do in Traverse City.
And just because you're suggesting canoeing, for instance, and boating, then we're not going in the dead of winter. So when would you recommend for this itinerary?
Well, the thing about the winter time is Michigan obviously gets a lot of snow, and the area around Traverse City gets quite a bit. All the West Coast does, because it's all lake effect snow with most of the weather patterns moving from west to east. The West Coast of Michigan gets a lot of weather. But it's good up there, too. People who like skiing and people who like snowmobiling or snowboarding, there is that access. Now, it doesn't have the huge mountains that Vail or Aspen would, but there are ski resorts in northern Michigan that are very popular. And for people from the Midwest, it's oftentimes a lot more practical to go to Michigan to a ski resort than it is to go to Colorado. The majority of their visitors do go during the summer.
Okay.
Sure, that's the biggest part up there. And in fact, Traverse City has a world-famous cherry festival. It's usually the first week in July. This year it's from July 3rd through 10th. And Traverse City during the cherry festival is bursting at the seams. The hotels are impossible to come by, and people stay as far as 2 hours away just to be a part of this cherry festival. So there is the winter option, but I would say that the majority of the visitors go up during the summertime. I mentioned Sleeping Bear Dunes, and obviously with my national park bias, we mentioned this in the first National Parks podcast we did. Sleeping Bear Dunes is about an hour west of Traverse City, and it is right on the Lake Michigan shore, and it's a great place for families. It has a world-class scenic drive called the Pierce-Stockling Scenic Drive, and it's got dunes that you can hike up and down, and it's a great place for families to go. As the National Park Service does, it has a lot of great interpretive centers. It's a very family-friendly atmosphere.
And as I recall, that's a national recreation area.
It's a national lakeshore, actually.
It's a national lakeshore, okay.
Yep. Yeah, it's a national lakeshore. Michigan has another one of those, which I'm going to talk about when I get to the Upper Peninsula, which is Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. And that's a completely different park. Pictured Rocks obviously doesn't have the sand dunes. It has boat tours, which you take out on Lake Superior, and you see all these fantastic rock formations. Some of them are colored, some of them, like a specific one that I know of called Miner's Castle. It's a specific rock formation that all the boat tours go by, and people like to go out there and take pictures. And while Lake Michigan may be good for swimming, Lake Superior is not always as conducive to swimming, because since it's so far north, it rarely gets much above 50, and swimming in 50-degree water is pretty cold.
And when we talk about Lake Superior, so for those of you who don't have a map of Michigan in your head or who aren't holding up your hand, Michigan's surrounded by water on three sides. And we got Michigan on the left side or the west side, Superior above it, and then to the right is
Huron.
Okay.
Yep. And also down by Detroit, we actually border Lake Erie as well. That's
what I wasn't sure. That's why I hesitated there for a second.
That's the lake that we share. We have a small portion of Lake Erie shoreline. Most of that is Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
So it's funny, the three main lakes that we have here, Superior and Huron and Michigan. Michigan, its coastline is a lot of dunes. I'm partial to the Lake Michigan coastline. I believe it has some of the most amazing sunsets in the world. Now, I know a California guy would probably argue that the Pacific Ocean produces them, but I'm partial. And
I'd probably argue for Hawaii, but, that's just me.
Well, see, there you go. That too. I've seen sunsets. I just recently saw some over the Mediterranean. I think because my heartstrings pull towards Michigan, that I'm always going to be biased towards my Lake Michigan sunsets. And I'll send you some of my best pictures to show in the enhanced version and plead my case for the Lake Michigan. But it is dunes. It's a lot of recreation. Lake Superior in the north, like I said, is more of a rocky coastline. The beaches aren't as fantastic, but it does make for better hiking, and it makes for much more wilderness type feel. Lake Huron on the east side of Michigan, whereas most of the dunes along Lake Michigan shore are elevated, and that's the same way in Lake Superior. You've got a lot of high places to look out over the lake. Lake Huron's coastline is much calmer, and they've also got some good beaches, but it's much lower, and it's not as hilly, and it's not as scenic. Again, I said my bias towards Lake Michigan, but Lake Huron, I haven't found it as scenic, but it's also beautiful there, and because it's on the other side of the state, you can get a beautiful sunrise on Lake Huron and then drive across the state in 4 hours and get a beautiful sunset on Lake Michigan. That's the kind of diversity I like to see in a state.
And again, when we talk about the Great Lakes, I'm not sure that everyone, especially some of our listeners outside the U.S., are picturing that these are interior seas. They are fresh water, but they are some of the largest interior bodies of water in the world. I don't know where they rank off the top of my head. I know they're not number one, but
They're the three I just mentioned are all in the top 10. So yeah, they are inland seas, and you look at it on a map. You can't see Wisconsin from the shores of Michigan. You can't see Ontario, Canada across Lake Huron. These are enormous lakes. Lake Superior borders mostly Michigan and Ontario to the north, but also some Minnesota and Wisconsin as well. And I think that's one of the things I've mentioned about Michigan is people don't understand how enormous it really is. You can look at it on a map, and yet you still don't understand how big it is. I wanted to talk real briefly about the Upper Peninsula, which
absolutely
you don't hear a lot about the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. And I understand that because one of the things that people need to understand about it is 1/3 of Michigan's land area, and it only has 3% of our population.
Well, the reason you don't hear about it is when you hold up your hand, there's nothing representing the Upper Peninsula, so it's really your own fault.
I know. Well, actually, you could hold up your other hand kind of in another way, and it kind of makes the UP because the thumb sticks out like there's the Keweenaw Peninsula is actually a peninsula that sticks out in the UP, and it could be your thumb area. So we'll work on that, Chris, just for the amateur traveler. We'll work on that. But the UP is enormous. Like I say, it's 3% of the population. Downstate where I live, we kind of make fun of the people from the UP. They're called Upers. Again, we refer to the Upper Peninsula as the UP. And the people aren't backwards. They're just people who have chosen to live a different lifestyle. And the lower half of Michigan where I live is just like any big city anywhere. It's a lot of rush on the go. When you get into the Upper Peninsula, you can sense instantly that you are not in that kind of area anymore. You are in a vast wilderness. And in the wintertime, the Upper Peninsula has probably just as many snowmobiles on the road as it does cars because the distances between cities are so vast that that's one of the preferred modes of transportation of people who live in the UP, that it's easier to get around with a snowmobile a lot of times than it is even with a four-wheel drive car. It's its own area. It's this gorgeous area of natural beauty. There's Tahquamenon Falls State Park. It's the area that Longfellow wrote about in his famous poem, The Song of Hiawatha. It's two major waterfalls, which is the upper and the lower. The upper one being one of the largest waterfalls east of the Mississippi. But it has 40 miles of hiking trails, and it can have that much because, again, the area is just uninhabited. And I mentioned Pictured Rocks already, which is famous for its boat tours from a town called Munising, but also for hiking and backcountry camping. Michigan also, the Keweenaw Peninsula, which I mentioned, they call it copper country. And it is sites of one of the largest copper deposits anywhere in the U.S. And it has now been mostly exhausted. So the National Park Service came in and set up a National Historic Park called Keweenaw National Historic Park, which preserves an old copper mine, but also preserves part of a downtown of one of the cities up there. And it's one of those national park units that encompasses a number of different sites. Now, they're not all owned and managed by the National Park Service, but they work in affiliation with the National Park Service. So it's all about the copper mining history of northern Michigan, which not just people around the United States wouldn't have heard about. I would venture a guess that many people from Michigan themselves haven't heard of this either.
Yeah, no, I was unfamiliar that Michigan had a copper mining history.
We have mountains, too, actually. I should preface this by saying that the mountains are only about 2,000 feet high. But up in the Upper Peninsula near the Wisconsin border, there is a state park called Porcupine Mountain State Park. And they're not even in the range of the Appalachian Mountains. They're extended hills. But again, when you think of Michigan, you would never think of mountains, but these are actual mountains. And Porcupine Mountains, it's a smaller area, but it's still neat to be able to drive up. And they have a number of high altitude, for Michigan, freshwater lakes and abandoned copper mines. And there's a specifically beautiful area called the Lake of the Clouds where you can take this long winding road up. It's where the Carp River runs out of this beautiful lake that's this really blue, crystalline blue color. And again, it's an area that you wouldn't expect in Michigan. You just wouldn't, when you think of Michigan, you just don't think of mountains.
No, I'm not sure that 2,000 feet quite qualifies for us. We don't name those, by the way, just out here. But in a lot of parts of the world, that would definitely qualify as a mountain. So that's just my California bias coming in there. Even more so than what the wineries allow to say.
Yeah, we'll take what we have as far as the mountains go. One last thing about the Upper Peninsula, and it's hard to even quantify this as Upper Peninsula, but Isle Royale National Park is a island out in Lake Superior, which is actually closer to Minnesota than it is to Michigan, but it is technically part of Michigan, even though the whole island is National Park Service territory. It's an island that is 45 miles long and 9 miles wide, and it's famous for its wolf and moose populations. A lot of scientists like to go there and investigate the relationship between predator and prey, because it's a very interesting relationship the two herds have out there on Isle Royale. And Isle Royale has been made famous. There's a author who writes books about the national parks named Nevada Barr, and she's written 2 books about the national park at Isle Royale. And I'm sure they're both available on your sponsor, audible.com.
Excellent. What do people recommend to do in Michigan that you don't see the attraction for?
I would say that the thing I hear most that people really like to do, this is a personal bias, but not only do we have Indian casinos, Detroit has also got a lot of casinos downtown. I'm just not a casino guy, and that's what a lot of our visitors here come in, and I ask them, well, what did you see in Michigan? And, we saw the casinos in Detroit, and we went to the Soaring Eagle Casino in Mount Pleasant, which is a very large casino. We went to some of them around Traverse City as well. And I think, well, if all you're here for is to visit the casinos, I mean, Vegas has better casinos. Don't get me wrong. The Michigan casinos are gorgeous and are really nice, and they're not competing with Vegas, but they're pretty good in their own right. But I don't understand why you would come to a state of such natural beauty and spend all of your time in a casino. There is a remarkable number of tourists that just do that.
Now, the one place that I mentioned that you didn't mention is Mackinac Island.
Yeah, I have it on my notes here. Mackinac Island, of course, it's spelled Mackinac. I'm really proud of you that you pronounced it the correct way, because most people say, I'm going to Michigan, I'm going to Mackinac Island. That's the way it's spelled. I can't even begin to tell you why we pronounce it Mackinac. Mackinac Island is a pedestrian-only island. You can get around via bike and by horse-drawn carriage. But it is near the bridge that connects the 2 peninsulas, the Upper and the Lower Peninsula. And you take a ferry to it, and it's just cute. It's what you would imagine America looked like before the automobile. It has a cute little downtown. Mackinac Island is famous for its fudge. I think every other shop on Mackinac Island is a fudge shop. So you can go there and really put the pounds on quickly. But it's also got cute little fish restaurants and some just cute out-of-the-way shops and stuff like that. It's also got one of the most beautiful hotels in America by the accounts of every magazine I've ever read, and that's the Grand Hotel. The Grand Hotel is so fancy that after 6:30 p.m., they require all of their guests, if you're a man, to wear a coat and tie, and women have to wear dresses after 6:30. So it's a pretty fancy place. Even to go there on a tour, I've heard it's as much as $35 just to tour the grounds. So, but you can get some great pictures of it, and you always see it approaching on the ferry. It's one of those places that when you see a picture of it, you say, oh, yes, I've seen that before. So that's what Mackinac Island is. But again, Mackinac Island's small. It's about 8 miles around, I think. And most people, what they do is they either bring their bike over or they rent a bike and they bike around the island. And that's one of the attractions, as well as the little downtown area.
Okay. And the other place I can think of that a lot of people, at least in America, have heard of in Michigan that you didn't mention that is fairly famous is Battle Creek.
Yeah, Battle Creek is home to the Kellogg factory. And that's one of the things that I think people do there.
Now, isn't there also a historic site there? Because Kellogg had some interesting ideas, both in terms of how people should be managed in urban renewal and all sorts of other things. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there's a historic village there that documents some of his peculiarities, let's say.
Yeah, he was an interesting guy. The place you're talking about, I believe, is the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and that's in the Matthew Broderick film Road to Wellville that was made famous by that. It is one of those things that I visited and was not blown away. Like, Battle Creek is one of those places you just asked me about, everybody talks about, and I've never really seen the appeal. It's cute, and the Kellogg factory is great for kids. But I think a lot of people leave there less than impressed with that. But the sanitarium is also interesting because he was a very interesting guy, and almost everybody's familiar with the name Kellogg. They're not quite able to associate that man with what his interesting social experiments were. And boy, coming up with what his experiments were off the top of my head, it's been a while since I've even seen that movie. And you're right, it's a lot about how to manage people. He had a lot of specific ideas on how to make people function the best they could, as in making blood flow to different parts of the body properly helped in your overall wellness. That is an attraction there. Again, it's one of those that I haven't visited in a while. And I think I visited when I was a teenager and thought, thanks, Mom and Dad, for taking me to this. But you're right, a lot of people do know that name and that city in specific.
Okay. And you had mentioned trying the fudge in Mackinac Island. What else should we try and eat when we're in Michigan?
Well, there is something specific to the Upper Peninsula called a pasty. And the Upper Peninsula of Michigan was settled by two specific ethnic groups, the Finns and then
the Cornish? Okay.
Yes.
So it's like a Cornish pasty then?
It is a Cornish pasty, except it's been changed a little bit for Michigan. And what it is, I was trying to figure out how to describe it last night, and I looked it up, and it was described online as a meat turnover. So I guess I'll live with that description, but it's breaded on the outside, and it has meat and most of the time potatoes on the inside, and they are unique. I've never heard anybody say, wow, these are great, but they are quintessentially Michigan.
Well, and the Cornish miners would eat the pasties because it gave you a nice handle to hold onto, this crust seam that you could hold onto, and your hands were encrusted with, and I'm trying to remember what the mining is in Cornwall, I want to say tin. You didn't necessarily have your hands clean, and so you would eat it by that crust and then would throw that crust away, that seam away, so that you wouldn't have to get your hands on the part you ate.
It's like a food with a grip. That's a good
exactly,
way. Exactly,
a food with a grip.
Handle to it. Sure. And like I say, I don't think that it's a most glamorous type of food, but it is one of those experiences. When you drive into the Upper Peninsula from Wisconsin or even from the lower part of Michigan, there are roadside stands that advertise these all over. It's become kind of famous, and you got to stop and try one because that's what you do. I will say, food-wise, Dearborn, Michigan, where I mentioned the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village, is the largest Arab city outside of the Middle East. So you can
Dearborn, Michigan.
Yes,
okay.
You can get some of the most amazing Arab dishes here. In preparing for my trip to Israel, I was able to become more familiar with a lot of this food because it was available in the area I came from.
Interesting.
And in fact, I thought when I was in Israel that I would have trouble coming home and finding good hummus and good tabbouleh and good Arab salad, but sure enough, I got home and there are markets all over the place that sell that stuff. So, and it's not something a lot of people know, but yeah, Dearborn, Michigan is where to go for that. They have lots of great markets. So if you've been to the Middle East and you think I'm never going to find this good of food in the United States, that you'll be pleasantly surprised at Dearborn, Michigan.
Any particular places we ought to stay if we go to Michigan?
I mentioned a bunch of times Traverse City. If you're going to go to Traverse City, you can camp there. The Sleeping Bardoons has got some great campgrounds. One of the explosions of Traverse City is the number of hotels. So you can definitely find good hotels in Traverse City. The shoreline itself is dotted with 5-star resorts. There is a resort outside of Traverse City about an hour called the Crystal Mountain Resort, which is, all of these places are very expensive, but they are mini cities in amongst themselves, and they are places where you could go and spend your whole vacation there and in the area surrounding, and you would have been well invested. The thing I would say about Michigan is the camping is wonderful. The state park system is very, very good, especially for a state which has some economic issues. The state parks have done very well, and both of our national park units, 3 including Isle Royale, the campgrounds there are all very good and very scenic. The experience of spending a night at a campground on one of the lakes is a great experience because wherever you are, Superior and Michigan have, like I said, have the great sunsets, and Huron has the great sunrises. The experience of camping, and if you're not a camper, you could find a hotel that does it too. But the experience of being on the water, either early in the day or late in the day, is just one of those quintessential Michigan experiences. It's a very peaceful feeling. And you see that in all the towns that are on the lake. The people wander out to the dock or to the shoreline at sunset. And it's a very peaceful, it's a very calm feeling. And I'd say if you haven't had that experience somewhere, if you've done it in a beach resort like in Florida or something like that, it's a completely different experience. These aren't beach resorts where everybody goes. These are actual towns that are lived in, and it's a really nice feeling.
And when you say beautiful, my picture of Upper Michigan especially is that we're talking a lot about, I want to say, evergreen forests.
Evergreen for sure. Yeah. There's also a large area of hardwood forest in the Upper Peninsula as well. Michigan, and I can't believe I almost made it through a podcast without mentioning this. When you mentioned when was a good time to visit, well, the fall is a great time to visit if you can catch the changing of the colors. The drive from Traverse City, Michigan, up to Mackinac City, which is right by the Mackinac Island Ferry, that is one of the most amazing drives that you'll ever do when the leaves are changing. I know New England, especially Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine are famous for their colors, but Michigan is just as good. The drives are just remarkable. You're driving alongside the beautiful lake. on the one side, and then you're driving with all these amazing colors. And that's another real popular time in Northwest Michigan, is to go up there and watch the colors change. It's a really...
And that's roughly what time then?
It's late September to early October.
Okay.
Yep. And again, if you're going to do that, you'll also want to probably book your hotels in advance. That's generally the rule with Michigan coast, is a city folk. When we get ready to get out, we go to the campgrounds to go to the hotels. So you'll find a lot of booking issues during the summer. So make your plans in advance, because not only people from Michigan, but we have a large number of people from Chicago also drive up into the Lake Michigan area. And Chicago is also a major metropolis and kind of crowded in Michigan, especially on those shorelines during the summer.
And what's going to surprise me when I come to Michigan?
I think more than anything else,
besides the wineries, I really have to include that already. So
I would hope that you, as a California person, when you get to Michigan, can say to me, you know what, you're right about those wineries. I'm a California guy and I know good wine, but your wineries are good. That is one of the things I think that surprises people. Not just that there are...
Let's calibrate here. I've got a $2 chuck sort of palate, so I'm not sure that I'm the best judge. But
well, somebody with a good California palate needs to let me know that they were impressed by Michigan wine, because I've met the people who are. That is one of the things that does surprise people, is the number of wineries. It's not just the number of them, it's the kinds that there are. There are the small ones, like I mentioned, which are a number of gems. And then there are also the big ones, which have, if you look up Michigan wine on a website, you'll see that a lot of them have won awards. But it's not just about wine. It's just the fact that Detroit especially gives Michigan a bad name. You think that everybody in the state's got to be really down because of the economy, but the people in this state soldier on. They're a fiercely patriotic people. We're proud to be from Michigan. Again, like I say, my reaction to people when I tell them I'm from the Detroit area says it all. People are a little taken back, but I don't just consider myself a Detroiter. I consider myself somebody from Michigan, and we're incredibly proud of what our state has to offer. And I mean, we've talked before. I have done a lot of traveling, but I live in Michigan by choice, and I'm really proud to be here. And almost anywhere I go, I've seen a lot of beautiful things. And I think Michigan may not be able to top this. It may not have better wineries than Napa. It may not have better mountains than the Rockies, but we have a little bit of everything. And again, I think that surprises so many people.
Okay. As we start to wind this down, the best day you've had in Michigan?
The best day I've had in Michigan. Well, it's like a groundhog. It's like Groundhog with Bill Murray. The day keeps repeating itself, because every time I go, there is a little hamlet on the coastline of Lake Michigan called Arcadia, where I spent some of my youth going to a Lutheran camp there. And my most vivid memories of this state aren't all the years I spent living in Detroit, is being with good friends, sitting on that beach, watching that fiery orange ball descend into Lake Michigan, and not just watching the sunset itself, but sitting there for hours afterwards, watching the sky turn all these beautiful colors, even after the sun was gone. And then when the sun's completely down, you have this brilliant starscape above you, and having campfires on the beach. I've had so many days like that on Lake Michigan shore that's why I keep going back to the Traverse City area, because that means so much to me. Whenever I need to be calmed, I can pull out my collection of Lake Michigan sunsets and just get back to any one of those days.
Last two questions. I think you know what's coming here.
I might have an idea.
Finish this sentence. You really know you're in Michigan when what?
You really know you're in Michigan when you are exhausted from doing outdoor activities all day, and you've had a nice cookout in a campground with good close friends, and you're getting ready with everyone. You've got your blankets draped over your shoulders, and you're barefoot so you can kind of walk in the water, and you're getting ready to go out and watch that sunset on one of the lakes. It's a family ritual around here.
Okay. And if you had to summarize your home state of Michigan in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Well, I actually thought about this one because I've listened to a few of your podcasts. And the last time you asked me this, I didn't come up with any good ones. I would say unexpected and underrated are the first two. And I know that those are very similar, but I can't emphasize those enough that it's more than what you know. And then natural is the third one I came up with. Okay. It's an area of just tremendous natural beauty. Excellent. Well, Erik, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your obvious love for your home state. Thanks for having me back, Chris. It's an honor. I have one internet resource for you today, and that's what I have started to use for the Amateur Traveler Photo Gallery. This is a site called smugmug.com, and Smugmug replaced the photo gallery that I had previously there. It has a lot of new functionality that is useful for
Pro photographers or pro-am like me, you can sell your photos, you can style your galleries, you can put it under your own domain. So this is travelphotos.amateurtraveler.com. If you're interested, take a look at that new photo gallery. If you want one, I can save you $5 if you go to amateurtraveler.com/smugmug. So check that out. I have a new contest, which is the Energizer Ultimate Photo Contest, where you can win a free trip to Greece. And they wanted me to promote it, so they gave me a prize that I could give to you. So if you go to amateurtraveler.com/contest, you'll see the details. And then if you leave a comment to that, at the 1st of July, I'm going to look at all the comments on that post. And I'm going to delete, obviously, spam comments, but I'm going to look at all the comments that are left on that post. And for someone who is from the U.S., this has to be someone from the U.S., I'm going to pick a winner who's going to win a portable photo printer. So check that out, amateurtraveler.com/contest. I got a comment this week from one of my favorite commenters on the Amateur Traveler, and that is Agaguga. And he had this to say: the main attraction for Singaporeans who go to Hong Kong seems to be eating and shopping. Unfortunately, the historical aspect is not as strong as in Macau. At the Giant Buddha, not only meat, but also wine is forbidden. This was quite amusing. I'm going to skip some of the comment because it's quite long, but he says, I'm told the standard of English has plummeted in Hong Kong since the handover. I can't speak to that. We didn't have any trouble getting along in English, but there have been a lot of new people who have arrived from the mainland since the handover, so there could be quite a few people who haven't had as much English. And he also says, Hong Kong is famous for roast pigeon and goose. Well, that I did not know. And Yong Kee is the most famous place with lettuce. So it's a longer comment. Check out all the rest of that at the Hong Kong episode. I did mention last week that your time was running out to sign up for the Egypt photo tour. July 8th is the date that I mentioned. I want to clarify a little what that means. July 8th, some of the slots that we have reserved, actually all of the slots that we haven't used that we have reserved, will go away. Now, I don't know at that point whether you'll still be able to get on the tour. It depends. But if you want your best chance, then doing it before then, we can use one of the slots that we already have reserved. With that, we're going to wind up this show. If you have any comments, feel free to leave them at amateurtraveler.com or drop me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com or catch me on Twitter at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe.